Alright/x/ let me give you a story about something freaky that happened in Innawoods on a farm about 5 years ago. I was a 17-year-old farm boy. Our place was about a mile from our nearest neighbor and 10 miles from the nearest town. My parents had taken a trip with my aunt to Vegas for a week and left me to run the place with the dogs. There had always been some weird stuff going on around the farm. Animals going missing, animals turning up torn up, weird tracks etc. Dad and Grandpa always told me it was the coyotes. But after I had gotten a bit older they had told me there had also been sightings of bobcats and mountain lions back in the area for the first time in over 50 years. But the DNR boys would never admit to it. Even with trail cam footage of them. I had been talking nightly walks for a couple of years but never farther than the big lamplight would show. One night I start walking and go away from the farm and the light. It was a full moon and there was fresh snow on the ground. Everything was clear for miles and you could see like it was almost daylight. Something possessed my dumb ass to go out there in the middle of winter by myself. My dogs would usually come with me on little walks like this but they were nowhere to be found. I figured they were out hunting little rodents or something so I left without them. I walked the path along our empty cornfields and down the path that led to our pasture. It was about a quarter of a mile downhill walk. Down in this pasture there is a canyon and a creek that runs through the whole thing. From our end of the property all the way to the next county. Inside of this there is a pretty sizable forest with huge old trees all the way down. It was one of those places that was perfect to grow up near. I spent a lot of time down there throughout my life and never really had anything out of the ordinary happen. I had my headphones in and was listening to some hammer fall. Just enjoying how cool everything was and how lit up everything seemed, even past the tree line. I figured me being just over 6 foot tall and an overly cocky weightlifter I didn't have anything to worry about out there. So dumbass me went down next to the creek bed, in the middle of winter alone and unarmed. Mistake number 1. I followed the creek for quite a ways until ended up at a part of the bed where the banks and walls of this little canyon were too angled to climb up and there weren't any paths out. I stopped for a little bit and watched the moon and stars, just admiring it all. Don't think I'll ever forget how pretty everything was. About that time I turning my music off just to take it all in. I guess it wasn't cold enough for the creek to freeze all the way. And every little sound out there in this place just echoed on top of the little sounds of the running water. The whole place just made every one of my scenes feel exaggerated. I stood there for about a minute or two when I started to get this horrible feeling in the pit of my gut. Like the most terrible thing in the world was going to happen at any second. I looked around a bit, didn't want to freak myself out over nothing so I gave it a short time. Was mistake number 2, I should have just walked out of there. At this point I started to hear something moan through the snow and brush on the other side of the creek. I'm pretty sure if it had been any other time or place I wouldn't have noticed it. Was so damn quiet. Besides that little bit of water I started to look around and spotted a little bit of brush among a few yards from the side of the creek bed. The only sounds were those exaggeratedly amped up steps causing the thin coat of ice to crack and snap on the long grass near the shore. I won't lie, every horror story and terrible thing I've ever heard about run through my head, and I ended up just being stuck there. Unable to move away while this thing continued to creep out along the bank. I hadn't even seen it, and suddenly I just had the worst fear I had ever had in my life to this day. Finally this thing came out, and by Lord, I almost pissed myself. This big black dog looking thing came crawling out near the creek on all fours. It was so big I don't know how the hell it had moved so quietly. It kept walking along in the open before it stuck its muzzle down in the creek and started to drink. I just stood there glued to the spot. The whole place seemed to get darker with every second. About this time, I felt the cold for the first time that night while this chill ran down my spine. Stupid me shivered. Mistake number 2. I had big copper buttons on my coat, and a couple of them brushed against each other. It had to be such an insignificant sound, but down there, it seemed like had hit a tin roof with a hammer. This thing perked its ears up and raised its head to look at me. God, its eyes. I've never seen anything that green before. We stared at each other down for few moments, and then this thing growled. About this point I finally snapped out of it and began to back away, trying to get back out of this boxed-in space and away from this thing. This thing started to bare its teeth and growl more aggressively. And then, shit you not, it stood up on its hind legs a bit, raising its front paws up to its sides, only they were not paws, they were like hands. I thought was going crazy or something, but I kept slowly backing off. Every step getting me a little closer to the path leading out of the canyon and creek, but even then I still had a long way back to the house. This thing just kept watching me like it wanted me to just back away and leave for the first few steps. Then it started walking along the other side of the creek, matching my pace. Just slowly stalking me out. I was shitting my pants and breathing heavily, but somehow managed not to lose my head and run. I think if I had done that, I wouldn't have made it out. Finally I made it to the open area, just had to get up this little hill, then make it across the pasture. Then it was only a quarter of a mile up another hill to home. I didn't turn my back on this thing and continued to back my way out and up the hill. This thing didn't seem to want to cross over the creek from the position I was at. But it kept walking. About time I made it to the top, and was looking down at this dogman thing. It had made it to a more shallow spot down at the creek bed and began to cross. At this point, I knew I had to pick up the pace. I finally turned and began to quickly walk to the pasture gate as quickly as I could. I scrambled over the gate and looked back again. It was at the top on all fours again, still watching me with those eyes and teeth. All that was between me and this thing was a barbed wire fence, a panel gate, and 20 yards. That's when I heard the best sounds I've ever heard in my life. Loud padding coming across the field. All 3 of my dogs were coming full speed down the hill, raising hell. I looked back and this thing turned and stalked back down the smaller hill. I figured I was in the clear and took off like a rocket. I ran a quarter mile in nearly 4 inches of snow in winter gear. I passed my dogs on the way up, and they didn't stop or turn to greet me. They just bolted down the way after this thing. I felt like an hour running up this hill. I made it back to my home, and almost passed out on the floor. I locked the doors and ran to grab something to defend myself. I figured that my hunting knives weren't going to cut it, so I went to the gun safe. Only guns in house are my great-granddad's old double-barrel 20-gauge, a 22, and an old pump-action Remington 30-06 pump-action with a box 40-year-old ammo that had a horrible jamming problem. I grabbed the shotgun and loaded 2 shells before shoving a couple of fistfuls into my pockets. I just sat there in the kitchen with a death grip on this gun for hours before finally heard my dogs barking outside the house. I looked out the window onto the porch and saw all three of them without a scratch. I dropped down onto my ass and cried like a child, not sure what to think. I didn't want to go out there again. And I didn't until the next morning. I stumbled out the door with the gun and looked around. My boys came up panting with their tails wagging, and loved on them and petted until my body was numb from the cold. I made sure they got some hot meat that night as a thank you. I've seen this thing a few more times than this, but this was the first time. The only people who know about this are a couple of my closest friends. Hell of a story. I don't live on the farm anymore at the moment. But that thing turned what was my little retreat into a nightmare.